I feel this is a great honor for me today. I get to introduce what I would consider some economic titans in Ohio. So Bill Lafayette being one individual I've heard a lot about over the years and have gotten an opportunity to meet. And Ned Hill as well, our next speaker. Heard a lot about him. I first was hearing about him when Larry Libby was our Swank chair. And he talked about this guy, Ned Hill at Cleveland State University and the work he was doing. And so I learned a lot about that, about him then, and really enjoyed sort of reading about and seeing what he's done. And then he moved to Ohio State. I haven't got to meet him yet, so I'm glad to meet him in person. It's a great honor to introduce Ned. He's got an undergraduate degree from the University of Pennsylvania and his PhD from MIT. He's one of those folks who understands sort of how economies relate to geography, how people interact within economies, and has done a lot to understand, I think, sort of in addition to what we learned this morning about the manufacturing, a lot about the manufacturing in the state of Ohio and how it relates to our economy and how important it is. So without further ado, Ned Hill, who is right now a professor in the John Glenn College of Public Affairs. So without further ado, Ned, thanks so much.
Yeah, Brett, pleasure. Good morning, everybody. Now, I am so good at spatial stuff, I went to the wrong building. So just take that as a warning. I'm going to be talking much more about community development today than about economic development. And the reason for doing that is I want to talk about the other Ohio. The Ohio that's not on I-71, the 3C corridor. The Ohio that is not prospering along I-75 because of the revival of auto manufacturing. I want to spend some time talking about and help you begin to think about the Courthouse Square, Ohio. The Ohio that was part of the fabric that made us a great state. I also want you at the same time draw a set of connections between that other Ohio and forgotten Ohio, which is inner city Ohio. And many times, and we look at the data that John Bagala's put together, we're seeing the same set of social problems, same levels of drug addiction, similar levels of teenage pregnancy. But what's most disturbing of all is we can't find investment. And we're finding communities that really isn't in the top of mind of public policy and that we've been disinvesting in for a long time. And as an academic, I can publish that and go on from there and I'm done. But I decided that leaving you in a state of profound depression probably is not one of the best things to do, because what we're beginning to find out that there are green shoots in the other Ohio. We think about the work that Jim Rokakis is doing, bringing land banks around all corners of the state. We're beginning to see what the impact that natural gas could have in parts of Appalachian Ohio. We're in an absolute battle royal down at the State House to keep First Energy from screwing up the electricity rates and hurting investments in Ohio. We're fighting the legislature to prevent them from engaging in crony capitalism and lemon socialism. And this plays into this subject because if it becomes harder to invest in the state of Ohio, it becomes even harder to invest in the other Ohio. So what I want us to do today is I'm going to go through some of the issues. I'm going to give you some rules of thumb that I've observed, developed by observing communities. And I'm also going to ask you to start thinking about a playbook to bring back the other Ohio. Because this is what is absolutely brutally clear. It's clear from Portsmouth to Chillicothe. It's clear from Salina to Circleville. What's clear is that these communities have to take leadership themselves. They can no longer hope that someone from the outside is going to parachute in with bags of money and change their futures. So what I'm going to do today is think about asset-based strategies for the other Ohio. And remember, while I may be primarily showing pictures of courthouse square towns of counties that no longer have enough population to be viable, I also want you to think about inner city neighborhoods because the rules are the same. So let's see. Nice. Oh. I'll go this way. No, I won't. Down arrow. Let's see, how about if we go like this? Right now, we're at the frozen Ohio.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on.
All right, what just happened?
Okay, we probably shouldn't have it started, so try it now.
All right.
There.
Okay, so I am kind of I am not usually staged to a podium, but there's this little thing over here. Hi, guys. So I do this. So let's say the first thing that's really important to understand is pay attention to those guys over on the left-hand side of the screen. Those are two working guys. They came out of a factory. One says to the other, there it is again. The invisible hand of the marketplace has given us the finger. This is the way that most of us have thought about our economic future. You go up, Dave Claiborne's here from Marion, and he's talked about how Marion has basically taken victories and said, but it's still not the past. And we think about, but when I look at it, Marion, it's a community that's pulled itself together and started making its way to the future. So the fact is that victims never prosper. No one follows Eeyore. They'll pet Eeyore on the head, say it's cute, and then wish it was damn Tigger instead. So one of the things that we have to do, and this has happened in Cleveland, you know, the overnight sensation that was 40 years in the making, we had to get over a profound sense of victimhood. We had to stop blaming the outside, even though there has been public policy at the national level and trade and things are different. But the fact is that if we believe we are victims, we've increased risk for outside money. And we've also made it risky for us to invest in our own homes. So the first most important asset we have is the attitude of the people in the community itself. The other thing that we have to realize is that the purpose of a community changes over time. Now, what's fascinating to me is this map. I made certain it was in small font, so you did not know what was really there. Is a map of the Ohio Canal system from the 1880s. And if you look at the towns that were important way stops along that canal system, what you're really seeing is a list of communities that have been abandoned, disinvested. That's where, in fact, tomorrow night in Portsmouth, Ohio, they're having what they're calling it's almost an anti-Prozac rally, an anti-opioid rally, basically attacking the national media for only referring them to as a pill mill, as opposed to being a place that's revitalized. Portsmouth is one of those cities. So the purpose of a community changes over time, but if a community stays rooted ruthlessly in the past, it's not going to make its way forward. Economic purpose changes over time. So here's Pope John Paul. He died. He goes to heaven. The angel Gabriel meets him at the gates. He sees a big bucket of wings sitting there. And Gabriel explains to John Paul, we design them here, but labor's cheaper in hell. Purpose changes. And as industry ages and as products age, what happens is vibrancy also changes. So that means that we can't look back to the 1950s to find the purpose of our communities. Remember, the 50s were the time of Ozzie and Harriet. Harriet divorced Ozzie, he's now dead, and she's going to the old age home. We gotta figure something different. And we also have to realize is that you can't manage decline in a market economy. Decline is slow strangulation, but strangulation in what? If we try to go back to, Portsmouth wants to go back to the population it had in the 1960s, it's never gonna get there. It has to figure out a way and a path to success based with what's there and attracting what's new. So we have to learn from boiled frogs. All right, I'll leave and you try to figure out what the hell that means. But when you're thinking about if we're cooking up a bunch of frogs, what you do is you put them in a pot that's cold and slowly turn up the heat, and they're going to jump out when it gets hot enough. And what happens with slow decline and managing decline is it changes expectations, and you can't rally around change because, oh God, it's just watching the glacier melt. But the glaciers are melting faster. The other thing is if a place is not nice, it is dying. And nice is something that as an economist I cannot define, but damn, I know it when I see it. Nice is safe. Nice is welcoming. Nice is invested in. And the single most important thing that the other Ohio has to do is make certain that it has a graft-free but very aggressive and relentless building department and building code enforcers. And if you've got one slumlord owning your downtown, wrestling out of his greedy, dying fingers. Otherwise, you don't have control of your future. If the locals do not invest, people from away won't either. Did a lot of work in Duluth, Minnesota. I did so much work in Duluth, Minnesota, I can refer to it as Duluth and get away with it. But in Duluth, we interviewed every single person with money that had a history of real estate investment to try to figure out why they were investing in Scottsdale, Arizona, rather than their hometown of Duluth. And it was fascinating to find out that every single one of them was dying to invest in their community because they saw value, they saw opportunity, but they also saw a contentious city council that second-guessed everything and despised people who made money. It was easier to do it in Scottsdale. So they turned willing investors into heat-seeking geezers. So what we have to pay attention to, and this is where the optimistic side comes in, is realize that success depends on playing the long game and having a widely held strategy across the community. Why? Because economic development time is 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And if you want success in 2 to 3 years, I guarantee you failure. I guarantee you following fads. I guarantee you buying too many of Richard Florida's books. Oh, damn, did I say that? Oh, well. But it also depends on having a widely held strategy. Why? Because the life of a community can no longer be determined by 3 fat white guys sitting in a closet somewhere and rolling out and saying this is the future. It also can't depend on one single mayor, because one single mayor is going to hit a limit and it's going to be there for 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, not economic development time. Unless you're Don Pasquale, then you've got a century in Akron and things do change. So really, you need a vision of what the future could be. And I don't even care about the blocking and tackling strategy that ends up in a planning and zoning map. I want a reasonable, approachable sense of what our future is together. So community development then is a prerequisite. It's necessary for economic development to take place. But it's not sufficient. That takes investment. But I can guarantee you that if you do not invest in community development, if your schools suck, your roads are pitted, you drive down Main Street and it just looks like abandonment, I can guarantee you that economic development will not come. I will also guarantee you that if you're not well connected to a regional labor market and think regionally, that economic development will also not come. Why? Because the other Ohio is far enough away from the major metropolitan areas, those with more than 1 million people, that it doesn't have enough population to get the big attraction project coming from another country. Talk to my friends at Jobs Ohio frequently, and what they keep on saying is, it's driving us crazy. We can't get anybody to look south of Circleville. What's magical about Circleville? Is there a big wall there? No, what's magical is it's the last community in the Columbus metropolitan area, and it's the last community that can claim the number of workers in Columbus. So that means Chillicothe, Portsmouth, and Piketon, and we can go down that lovely highway, which is absolutely beautiful, and realize you guys have to market yourself together and your connection to Cincinnati, your connection to Columbus, and make certain that you make regionalism work for you. So community development, I put these couple of pictures up here because they're kind of amazing. The Newsweek cover is Carl Stokes, the first African-American in the city of Cleveland. Phenomenal human being, great family. I didn't know the mayor well, I knew the congressman pretty well. But Carl Stokes was America's first environmental mayor. Why? Lake Erie was dying. They used to pour chlorine in a fenced off part of a park so the kids can go swimming. And of course, we had all the litany of the river catching fire, even though in Cleveland it was kind of a shrug. The 1952 fire was bigger. But Carl Stokes knew that from his community, from the Huff neighborhood where he grew up, Fairfax community, which he represented, he understood that the city as a whole had to prosper if his constituents were going to prosper. And the thing next to it is a note he received from a kid that lived in Lyndhurst. All this, by the way, is in the Stradling Brothers book, Where the River Burned, which is a terrific book about Carl Stokes, the environmental mayor of Cleveland, and the coalition that brought it together. So I recommend you to read it. But it's not alone. That other picture way up in the top corner, that's Great Lake St. Mary's, Grand Lake St. Mary's, when the place where the first water oil well was drilled. And it was also an economic development tool because that lake was done to provide water to the canal system. Now it's in its third life as a recreational amenity, and there it is today with algae. In fact, we knew that we had a bad algae problem in Grand Lake St. Mary's when a dog fell into it and died of toxic shock. Community development takes place before economic development. And realize that the problem we had in Toledo is a problem we had in the Ohio River, which is a problem we had in Grand Lake St. Mary's. And so part of community development is dealing with and tackling of those sites. So what we all have to do is just stay calm and play the long game. And all of us are in short-term jobs. The typical economic development director of community keeps their job for 5 years. The typical planning director, especially in a small town, keeps their jobs for up to about a decade. So it really means to play the long game that has to be built deeply into civic space, which really means that you need to function as a community before community development takes place, before economic development takes place, and that takes genuine leadership, not the general Patton type of leadership. It's that connector that builds community. It's what happens at church suppers. It happens around the PTA. That is all that's part of what we have to do. So if we think about what brings a community together, and I just noticed that the slide got all out of sequence, so I'm going to put it all up. There really are 4 P's that we have to play with, and they're all long-term. The very first of the P is people. We need engaged people, we need smart people, we need educated people, we need people that we invest in. We need to pay attention to those kids, and we have to pay attention when they're teenagers, and we have to be able to make certain that those that want to work have a chance to work, and they learn the habits of work. But we also need, and that's what the evolution of the prosthetic is about, we need constant product innovation. Because if you don't have product innovation and an active growing portfolio of products in the regional economy, you aren't going to have growth, you aren't going to have income growth, and you're going to slowly die. So even in Ohio's major metropolitan areas, particularly up in Northeast Ohio, which if you look at the industrial codes, is a broadly diverse economy, when you start plotting where they are and the age of their products, they have old products and slow growing products. The other thing that you need is the middle figure is you need productivity. And I'm hearing people from the left complain about productivity. They're worried about people losing their jobs, not having another chance. Essentially, it's neo-Luddites coming back again, but realize that if you don't sell a product, you don't have economic development. If you do not sell a service, you do not have economic development. If you do not have increases in productivity, you cannot have wage gains. And if you do not have wage gains, you're going to be repelling your population rather than attracting your population. At the root is productivity. Here's the cool thing about it. The big way to affect productivity is not by taking your people and working them harder and reducing benefits. The way in which you improve productivity, which is value added for every hour work, is improve margin. And you improve margin by having better managers. You improve margin by inventing new product. You improve margin by engaging in process innovation and product innovation. But if you don't have companies with margin, you aren't going to have productivity. Means you don't have productivity and you can't have wage gains. And then the last thing, the things the planners focus on the most, is probably the least important, but it's in terms of the economy, most important in terms of community development, is you have to continually invest in good creative placemaking. That's part of reducing risk. Because the first thing an investor's going to do is drive down your main street, and if it looks like shit, you got problems. That's a technical term, by the way, I could say it. Oh, and I'm getting swapped out too. This is even better. So it's if you want to think about the elements of a strategy for a small place or a community, think about the 4 Ps: people, product, productivity, and place. It works. Here's playing the long game. Now, I found a postcard of what the main street of Kenton, Ohio looked like, and I dare you to go to Kenton, Ohio today and find the same feel and look of vibrancy. So how do you go about playing the long game? You have to provide immediate results and respond to crisis and politics. The single most important thing I learned from Cleveland and Cleveland's revival was one day when Jacobs Field opened. I still call it Jacobs Field. I'm not feeling progressive these days. And I went to Jacobs Field on opening, on that first, when they first opened up, and you know, they had these great curved benches all along the outfield. And I sat on that bench and just listened for a couple hours as people were staring in through the gate into left field. And what they said was absolutely jaw-dropping, but so enlightening. They looked, they stared, and they said, I didn't think we could do anything this nice here. They were victims. And what did they learn? A community that holds itself up to a high standard and takes a shot when opportunity presents itself. A community can change the way it thinks and feels, acts, and works. We also saw this. I don't have to go to Cleveland. I can go to Worcester, Ohio, which has the best Main Street manager in the state, that is really taking care of the fact that after Rubbermaid left and they lost 1.5 million square feet worth of employment, they took advantage of OARDC, they took advantage of the College of Worcester, they reinvested in their downtown, and they made certain that little micro sprawl didn't take place to realize that the heart and soul of Worcester goes from the fairgrounds down to the end of that main street. And they made certain there was enough density, so they ran into each other as a community. I'm going to talk about third places in a second, but we have to realize that successful communities in the other Ohio provide 2 types of investments. They invest in people. It makes no difference if you are Linden or if you are, and then take your favorite abandoned county seat. You got to invest in people. You invest in the way they can interact socially as well as in schools. And then you have to invest in place. We have people running against the investment and communities investing in their own future. If you do not invest, decline wins. So you need to invest, the municipal corporation has to invest in its own future. You need to invest in access so you can get elsewhere and people can find you. You need to make certain that your anchor institutions are working. And now if you think about anchor institutions, you think about Ohio State, you think about an art museum, on and on from there. Every community has an anchor institution. You have to find it. You have to identify with it. And you have to figure out how that anchor provides value to the community and how that community provides value to the anchor so it doesn't leave. The smaller the community, the smaller the anchor, the looser that anchor is into the mud of the lake. That was a really terrible analogy. I got to get it out of my head. We also have to make certain that places are safe, because if places aren't safe, investment doesn't come and people leave. John Colm, who set up a great organization called WireNet, once told me that he described his job. He's an advocate for manufacturing neighborhood in Cleveland. And I said, John, what's your job? And he said, I take care of the dead dog problem. Damn, what a great job. I want that in my business card. What the hell is a dead dog problem? He said that when a dog dies on a tree line in front of a factory, the city doesn't care because that factory doesn't vote who takes care and cleans up that dead dog. Because if that dead dog stays there, that factory owner is not going to invest there. And if that dead dog occurs over and over and over again, suddenly that plant's in Berea, that plant's in Lake County, that plant's in Kentucky. You also have to be a just place. If you're a community that balances your book through traffic tickets, stop it right now because you're pissing people off. And if you find out that those people are your own citizens and they're just nuisance tickets, you got a problem. And you have to judge people by what they can do and what they contribute rather than who they are and who their people were or where they were from. And that is the great thing about Ohio's history. That's the state that we should be, and that's the state we were, and I do believe that's still the state that we are. We just can't let politics drive that out. We also need local government that's honest. Why? Because look at when Ohio was a place that you had to be, petty corruption at the municipal level could exist. Why? Because you made enough money or you earned enough money so you could put up with that nonsense. But that isn't here anymore. And in the other Ohio, that's seen as just padding and feather bedding, and everybody in that community knows who's on the take, who's getting duped, or why a building permit isn't being permitted, isn't being processed, or, oh, that's just local politics, and that breeds cynicism. And above all, we need to make certain that we have a culture of respect, because if we don't have respect, the other thing doesn't happen. You know what? We can all do that. And we do it in our own lives. We have to speak about it as community value. And that community value is the foundation of economic development. So here are the 6 ingredients for success. This is a picture from one of the great wall murals down in Portsmouth, Ohio. Every community needs an economic purpose, even if it's being a bedroom and supplier of work somewhere else. If you do not have an economic purpose, you are dying, and you're dying rapidly. And understand that purpose. And that purpose isn't holding on to the past, because that past is going to move. You need to deliver the basic services extremely well. The toughest job in the world is being a mayor. Good thing the two mayors here. I don't see Nan. Oh, good. So I'm safe, so I can talk about mayors. The toughest job in the world is being mayors. Why? Because mayor is not really a political position. Mayor could be a tribal position, but mayor is not a political position because the potholes have to be filled. The cops have to be there. Emergency services have to work there. The mayor has to make certain the city works. And if the city needs more cash, the mayor has to be able to stand up and explain to the constituents why and what. Look at Lakewood, Ohio. Lakewood, Ohio had the 3rd highest school property taxes going to schools in the state of Ohio. It was a community in transition, blue-collar roots with rich people living out on the lake. What did the people in Lakewood, Ohio do? They took advantage of the school building programs and made sure it stayed in dense neighborhoods, and they taxed themselves extra to make certain that those schools were built. And it all started with an investment in a library. And without that, the revitalization of Detroit Road and Madison would never take place. And that cool, dense, walkable neighborhood could have been abandoned. That takes a mayor. You also have to make certain educational services are provided and provided well. You need leadership, and the place has to have a sense of vibrancy. Because if a place isn't vibrant, people are going to stay inside their houses, shut the door, and watch some sort of cable television. They can't figure out how I should buy it anymore. And you need diversity. And diversity is all type. Diversity is age, sex, family structure, race, ethnicity. That diversity science that you are judging people based on what they can contribute rather than who they are or who their people were. And you need those catalysts of distinction. Here is a gateway that goes to the farmer's market in Delaware, Ohio. And if you looked at Delaware 12 years ago, 15 years ago, you saw a place that was clinically depressed. They should have just put Prozac in the water and got it over with. They used to be prideful about the fact that they were the lawnmower capital of the world, but the grass wasn't cut in public spaces. And leadership took place and invested in the courthouse and invested in a farmer's market and had quality investment around it. So what are the catalysts of distinction? The first, pride of place. If you are proud about where you're from, if you aren't willing to tell people that this is what you're part of and who you are, you lose them. You need plug and play social structure. That's what I've been referring to. You need a sense of trust in your elected officials. The reason why people real estate investors didn't invest in Duluth was they didn't trust the political process. Political process didn't trust them. You need energy, and energy is people. It's not oil and natural gas. And you need civic risk-taking and resilience. And above all else, you need truly engaged citizens in an era where the newspaper is dead and dying. That's the hardest thing of all. And you need that through building dense civic networks. So what's the goal of all this? The goal of all this is to change the value of assets in your community. I did work in Camden, New Jersey a few years ago. In fact, well, a couple decades ago. In fact, just before the mayor was arrested for being bribed for going to an off-site hotel in Disneyland. But that's a different issue. He also got shag carpeting. The problem we had in Camden, one neighborhood actually had property values going up, and you had people complaining about gentrification. It wasn't gentrification. It's the only part of Camden where decline wasn't accelerating and investment was going on ahead of disinvestment. You have to change those asset values. Remember, everything has a value. Assets can be negative, assets can be positive. Just think about what the housing crisis did with all those abandoned buildings throughout the entire state. And every single one of those abandoned buildings, boarded up buildings, destroyed asset value around it and had to be tackled. You need to make certain that as places go up, you have a hedge for affordability, but that essentially is you have to do it with markets, don't do it through mandates. And here's the real goal. The real goal for the other Ohio is changing your relative position in the regional economy. It's changing where you are in the residential real estate world. It's changing where you are in the commercial real estate world. It's saying there that if you're up in Holmes County, you got to see a place that by relentless investment driven by culture is one of the most successful rural counties in the United States, not just Ohio. That's important. So if we think about the 5 developments, economic development, community development, housing development, workforce development, commercial and industrial development, real estate development, we focus on economic development because that's the fun stuff. Those are new jobs. Realize you need successful community development before that takes place, and you have to be part of a successful regional labor market. Workforce development's regional. It's not just you on your own. So here are 10 guidelines to pay attention to. And I'm sure that somehow this mysterious PowerPoint can end up on your desk, so you don't have to take tons of notes. The first thing is you got to find your own compass. Because while you may go around and find examples of what works in other places, you have to adapt it for your own community. Don't just adopt it. My favorite example here is if you look at the Inner Harbor in Cleveland and you look at the Inner Harbor in Baltimore, they look the same. Why? Because they took the plans and just moved them. And they didn't change it to be Cleveland. It's taken 30 years to change it so it becomes Cleveland. Adapt, don't adopt. Second, realize this decline cannot be managed. That's physics. What can be managed? You can reimagine the future. That can be led and managed. You can reposition the community within your region. That can be managed through investment. And you can help make reinvestment happen by removing risk and removing unnecessary bureaucratic barriers, and also exciting the community about its own future. But that public money at the local level is going to come in before private money. Market on its own will follow the path of lowest risk. 3, community counts and cynicism kills. That's a community value. 4, optimism is rooted that's rooted in reality reduces risk. Pie-eyed optimism, not rooted in reality, is just another person not to pay attention to. But it has to be real. 5, regions matter. And regions matter a couple of ways. One is the other Ohio is all too small to be an economy on its own, so it has to figure out how it fits into that larger economy. Regions matter because strategy differs by the size of the region and the community. Your distance from a big place. Mark Parcher is going to tell you about the difference in rural Ohio when you're close to or away from a metropolitan area. Regions are going to matter because assets are different by regions. Anchors are different by region. And location also matters because what happens in the broader region affects the perception of you. Remember that in economic development, the attraction target, the company from away that you want to come to your community is not going to find the other Ohio. It's too small. It's going to find a state, then a region, and then sites within that region. If you cannot play well regionally, you've just made it harder. And then you have to understand your anchor institutions. How location adds value to the anchor and how the anchor contributes value to the community. I've seen anchor institutions that were built and rebuilt during the 60s and the 70s. They'll tell you it's Brauhaus architecture. Hell no, it's a bunker designed to keep people away and disconnect it from the street. So when you think about it, those anchors are going to be very different. Like I said, it may be a church, maybe a Lions Club. It's most likely your library. It can be the courts. And what I'm beginning to see in the other Ohio is people going for cheaper land away from the core and making the place less walkable and community more fragile. 7, discover what is unique about your community and build from there. Because if we aren't unique, there's no reason why anyone should visit you. And if you aren't unique, there's nothing to distinguish you. And if nothing distinguishes you, you can't change your position in the real estate market. I did a big community speech in Portsmouth in the fall. It was a terrific opportunity, and I just loved being there. And I started talking about how Portsmouth really should take on the mantle of being part of Appalachian culture in southeastern Ohio. Why are they giving it to a bunch of New Yorkers who move to Athens and figure out what a mandolin is when they're 30? Hell, they say pawpaw, and they think a dog is giving them the paw. And so I had this clown came up to me and said, no, we don't want that image here. Why? Because people are going to think we're a bunch of hicks and a bunch of rubes. And I say, well, if you try to pretend that something you aren't, you're proving you're a bigger rube than you were to start with. And the other thing is you can't fight that image because it's in reality. Embrace it, make it better. Don't leave it to Berea, Kentucky to get all the money. Well, I don't know if he's going to pay attention, but what the hell. And make no little plans, but make feasible and actionable plans. That will help guide your future. So revitalization is a very long journey. So that means we have to share that map for a very long period of time to a very large number of people and get people excited about what's taking place. I can feel that vibe in Lancaster starting to happen now. Very different when the vulture capitalists were ripping the guts out of anchor hocking and leaving it for dead. And they've overcome a lot. And they're adapting access to Columbus as being part of their future. But the architecture and the heritage of Lancaster is part of their future. Fabulous. The mile markers consist of physical signs of achievement. If all you're doing is lots of processing and a lot of meeting and a lot of consensus building, and we're going to get the wisdom from the crowds crap, that's just process. And the only thing that's processed that Americans like is Velveeta cheese in mac and cheese. That's it. So that means every single year there's going to be a ribbon cutting. And every single year there's going to be a mark to success. Every single year there's going to be a celebration as to where the future is going to be. Why? Because that deters risk. So here I'm going to wrap up with 6 questions. I wonder if your community has the answers or you have the answers. So first, are you distinctive? If so, how? If you're another courthouse square town like the other 88 in the state, you're distinctive. Are you proud of who you are? Are you proud of what you can become? And is it not bullshit? 3, do you embrace newcomers? 4, are there third places and third spaces? The first place is home, the second place is work. Where are those third places so you can get together? And that's the beauty of the old courthouse square. That's the reason why as retail goes, coffee shops are being replaced and where little craft breweries are going all over the place. I hope it doesn't become the marijuana dispensary. Otherwise, the gummy bears are going to screw up your dog really bad. And are you willing to invest in your own future? If you aren't, move. And are you connected to the external economy? Because we have to trade. We're going to export labor. In rural Ohio, people will travel an open hour to get to work. It's not a problem. We got a beater culture. But what it actually takes is what Margaret Thatcher once said. No one would remember the Good Samaritan if they only had good intention. Get money well. You need some cash. So this is your assignment. This is your homework. We can't do it as a group. It's too bad because I talked too long. But you need to figure out with asset development, based development, what works. I would love it if every person here submitted to Zoe a small case study of what worked in your community. You ask the question, what are the examples of what seems to work to build economic vibrancy and community and gave people a sense of optimism that resulted in investment? How did it work? Why did it work? Here's the problem. When you guys bring in the fancy ass academics to work with you, realize that we're social scientists. The only thing a social scientist is really trained to do is to reject a hypothesis. We cannot accept anything. So that means we are nattering nabobs of negativism all the time. You're on the other side. You're practitioners. You have to worry about the future. You're in the world of investment. You have to know what works and inductively tell us what works. How did it take place? Who's the leadership? And if I had a workshop right now, I would take whiteboards around the room and have you guys figure out what are the questions to ask and where the answer is going to come from. So even though I start talking about how big that rock is we got to push, realize that momentum happens with consistent small movements. Those lovely theaters that were saved in downtown Cleveland and Playhouse Square, it wasn't a big planner that came in to save them. It wasn't a big mayor that came in to see him. It was a worker in the public schools that needed a space for a meeting, that walked into the playhouses and saw the ceilings crumbling and the place is deteriorating, and Ray decided to do something that made it his life work, and that was the start of Cleveland's revitalization. One person, one set of eyes, one incredibly determined human being, and he made change happen. We are going to take on and change the fate of Ohio. We're going to deal with the other Ohio if people have that exact same sense of determination. Some communities aren't going to make it just because of what's happening in rural Ohio and cynicism. But the fact is, the salmon will come home to spawn again if there's a place for them to come home to. Why am I talking about salmon? I don't talk about boomerangers coming back. I think about kids coming back to breed, so that's good. So on this note, I'm sure I'm way over my time. I thank you for your patience, and I'll pay attention to directions as to whether I have time to answer questions or not.
We do have a schedule of people. We do have time for a couple questions, so please, I'll let you figure out who you take.
Why am I so surprised that Gene was the first one to raise his hand? Gene.
Yeah, so you're stuck in an elevator with Michael Wine. The elevator breaks. You're now in there. What do you tell the governor to do?
Jump. On this particular issue, we have to, we've already gone down the road of the state doling out money through programs across the state and ended up with cement planters everywhere that did nothing. What we really need to do is how can the state provide incentives for places to invest in their own future? That's the single most important thing. The second thing is that if there is a community that's notoriously corrupt, send in the special prosecutors. Nothing happens until that's cleaned up, and it still exists in parts of Ohio. The other thing, third, which won't happen politically, is if a county has less than 40,000 people, abolish the county. Because it cannot support itself. I would keep the county name. Maybe you can put the county name on a sheriff's vehicle. But the tough thing is there are enough people that make their living off of the remains of dying and declining counties that politically it's impossible. And then probably the single most important thing, I would not say to the governor, I'd say to the staff, because it's way too in the weeds for the governor, but just what I challenged you with. Let's figure out what works. What worked in Worcester? What worked in Chardon? And that's really important. Not with a long paper or picture book. Figure out what barriers were removed. But that's a long list, so the elevator would have crashed and I would never get to the end of it.